Hi, my name is Sofia Martinez. I'm 29 years old, and I'm the youngest venture capital partner at Goldman Sachs in New York City. Every morning, I leave my modest studio apartment in Queens, take the subway through the bustling tunnels beneath Manhattan, and listen to the symphony of a city that never sleeps. The screech of brakes, the murmur of 100 languages, the rustle of newspapers. These are the sounds that ground me in reality. To anyone watching me emerge from the subway at Wall Street, I look like any other young professional in my simple black coat, comfortable flats, and a worn leather bag that's seen better days. My hair is pulled back in a neat ponytail. I wear minimal makeup, and my clothes come from department stores rather than designer boutiques. What they don't know is that behind this understated appearance, I manage investment portfolios worth over $500 million, make strategic decisions that can make or break startup dreams overnight, and earn more than $60,000 a month. Not because I'm ashamed of my success, but because I choose discretion over display. I don't need designer labels to validate my worth or expensive jewelry to announce my accomplishments. I want people to see Sofia the person, the woman who still gets excited about finding a good book at a street vendor, who knows the names of the security guards in my building, who brings homemade lunch to work because she genuinely enjoys cooking. Not Sofia the bank account, not Sofia the title, not Sofia the financial executive who could buy most people's dreams without checking her account balance. Even Marcus, my boyfriend of 8 months, doesn't know the full extent of my position or my earnings. And that's exactly how I want it. Marcus Williams is 31, a talented graphic designer with hands that create magic on canvas, and a heart so gentle it sometimes makes me ache. He works for a mid-sized advertising agency in Midtown, designing campaigns for local businesses and startup companies. When he talks about his work, his eyes light up with the kind of passion that money can't buy. He sees beauty in everything, the way morning light hits a fire escape, the expression on a stranger's face in the subway, the perfect shade of blue in a cloudless sky. But underneath that artistic soul carries the weight of family expectations that could crush mountains. His parents live in the Upper East Side, in one of those limestone mansions where old money doesn't whisper, it commands. Where every piece of furniture has a pedigree longer than most people's resumes, and where being comfortable is a gross understatement that only the truly wealthy can make with a straight face. The Williams family represents everything I've learned to be wary of in my professional life. The kind of people who measure worth in stock portfolios and social connections, who believe that the right last name opens more doors than hard work ever could. One chilly October evening, Marcus took my hands in his as we sat in our favorite coffee shop in the village, the same place where we'd first met. His voice was hesitant, nervous in a way I'd rarely seen from this man who could present creative campaigns to Fortune 500 executives without breaking a sweat. "Would you meet my parents this weekend?" he asked, his thumb tracing small circles on my knuckles. "They've been asking about you for months, and I can't keep making excuses." He paused, and I could see him choosing his words carefully. "They're particular about the people I bring home. Very traditional, very focused on image and social standing. I just want you to know that going in." I smiled warmly, squeezing his hands. "Of course I'll meet them. They're important to you, so they're important to me." But inside, a curious idea began to form like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. If his family valued status above substance, if they judged people based on their appearance and assumptions about their bank accounts, I wanted to witness their true nature when they believed they were dealing with someone they could dismiss without consequence. So I decided to play a role in my own little social experiment. I would show up as the version of myself they would expect to look down upon. The struggling finance worker, the girl from a poor background who was clearly out of her league with their son. But the moment I stepped through their mahogany doors that Saturday evening, the experience unfolded in ways I never could have anticipated. Because sometimes when you go looking for people's true character, you find more than you bargained for. About them, about the person you love, and ultimately about yourself. Have you ever hidden your true self just to see someone's real character? Have you ever wondered how people would treat you if they thought you had nothing to offer them? If you have, share your story in the comments. I'd love to know I'm not alone in this curiosity about human nature. Let me tell you where this story really begins, though. Not in a Manhattan coffee shop or at a dinner table in the Upper East Side, but but in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in the South Bronx, where the smell of sofrito always filled the air and neighbors looked out for each other's children like they were family. I grew up in a building where the elevator rarely worked, where the sound of salsa music mixed with the rumble of trains passing overhead, and where my parents taught me lessons about dignity that no Ivy League education could ever provide. My father, Miguel Martinez, spent 12 hours a day under the hoods of cars in a garage that barely kept the rain out. His hands were permanently stained with motor oil, and he came home every evening smelling like brake fluid and hard work. But when he walked through our front door, he would wash those hands carefully, put on a clean shirt, and sit down to dinner with my mother and me, as if we were dining at the finest restaurant in the city. My mother, Carmen, cleaned office buildings in Manhattan from midnight to dawn. She would leave our apartment when most of the city was sleeping and return just as I was getting ready for school, her eyes tired, but her smile always ready. She knew the names of every security guard, every janitor, every person whose office she cleaned, and they knew hers too. She treated everyone with the same respect, whether they were the CEO whose corner office she dusted or the maintenance worker she passed in the hallway. We lived in that apartment above Rodriguez Market, where Mrs. Rodriguez would let us put groceries on credit when money was tight, and where the teenager who stocked shelves would walk me home from school on days when my parents were both working. My parents never had much money. There were weeks when dinner was rice and beans for 5 days straight, when my school clothes came from Goodwill, when we couldn't afford to turn the heat up in winter. But in that cramped space filled with love and laughter and the constant sound of our neighbors' lives intersecting with ours, they taught me 2 lessons that shaped everything I became. First, dignity comes from within. It doesn't matter if your shoes are scuffed, or your coat is secondhand, or your dinner is simple. How you carry yourself, how you treat others, how you face the world, that's where your worth lives. Second, respect should never depend on the size of your wallet or the brand of your clothes. The measure of a person isn't what they own, but how they behave when they think no one is watching, when they have nothing to gain, when being kind costs them something. I still remember my mother coming home at 6 a.m, exhausted from scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans in buildings where people made more in a day than she made in a month. She would sit at our small kitchen table, counting quarters and crumpled dollar bills, planning how to stretch our grocery money through the week. "Mija," she would say, smoothing my hair as I ate my cereal before school. "Remember something important. Money doesn't make you better than anyone. Rich people, poor people, we all bleed the same color. How you treat people when you have nothing to gain from them, that's your true character." I believed her with every fiber of my being. Maybe that's why, even after achieving everything I'd once dreamed of, I never felt the need to wear my success like armor or use my wealth as a weapon. But those early years taught me something else too. They taught me how to recognize the look in people's eyes when they've already decided you don't matter. I saw it in store clerks who followed my mother around like she might steal something, in teachers who assumed I wouldn't amount to much because of my address, in the admissions counselor at my high school who suggested I consider community college instead of reaching too high with my university applications. That look, the one that says, "I've already decided who you are based on what I think I see," I learned to spot it from across a room. I earned a full scholarship to Columbia University, where I studied finance and economics with the intensity of someone who knew this was her one shot at changing everything. I worked 3 part-time jobs, shelving books at the library, tutoring underclassmen in math, and serving coffee at a campus cafe where entitled students would snap their fingers at me like I was invisible. I lived on instant ramen and peanut butter sandwiches, wore the same 3 outfits in rotation, and studied until my eyes burned and my head pounded. My dorm room was so small, I could touch both walls with my arms outstretched, and I could hear my roommate's every phone call through the thin walls. But I was happy, because every late night, every sacrifice, every moment of exhaustion was building the foundation of my future. My parents visited once during my 4 years at Columbia. They took the subway from the Bronx dressed in their best clothes, my father in a suit he'd bought for my high school graduation, my mother in a dress she'd been saving for special occasions. They looked around the campus with such pride, touching the stone buildings like they couldn't quite believe their daughter belonged there. We had dinner at a small Puerto Rican restaurant near campus, and my mother cried quietly into her mofongo because she was so proud of how far I'd come. My father, who rarely showed emotion, held my hand across the table and said, "You remember where you come from, Mija, but don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong wherever you end up." After graduation, with my degree in finance and economics and highest honors that felt like validation for every sacrifice my family had made, I started at a small investment firm in Brooklyn. No prestige, no corner office, no signing bonus. Just a metal desk in a cramped room, and the chance to prove that a girl from the Bronx could make it in the world of high finance. The firm handled small-scale investments for local businesses and middle-class clients saving for retirement. I analyzed market trends, built financial models, and slowly learned the language of money that felt foreign to someone who'd grown up counting quarters. My first year, I made $38,000, more money than my parents had ever seen at once. I cried when I got my first paycheck, not because it was so much, but because it represented possibility. The possibility that I might never have to choose between paying rent and buying groceries, that I might be able to help my parents, that I might build something my children would never have to worry about. I was good at my job, better than good. I could spot market patterns that others missed, understand the psychology behind investment decisions, and explain complex financial concepts in terms that regular people could understand. Within 2 years, I was managing larger portfolios. Within 3, I was being recruited by bigger firms. That's when Goldman Sachs came calling. The interview process was intimidating. 3 rounds of meetings in their gleaming tower, surrounded by men in $3,000 suits who spoke in acronyms and assumed everyone shared their cultural references. I showed up in my best outfit, a black suit from Macy's that I'd saved for 2 months to buy, and answered their questions with the knowledge I'd earned through sleepless nights and relentless studying. When they offered me a position in their venture capital division, I negotiated my salary like my mother had taught me to negotiate everything, respectfully but firmly, knowing my worth even if they couldn't see it yet. 7 years later, I became the youngest partner in the division's history. I was making decisions about investments that could make or break startup dreams overnight, managing portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and earning more in a month than my parents had made in entire years. But success in that world came with constant reminders that I was different. Colleagues who assumed I was diversity hiring, clients who asked to speak to my supervisor before learning I was the senior person on their account. Networking events where conversations stopped when I mentioned where I grew up, as if my background was either pitifully inspiring or vaguely threatening. I learned to navigate their world without losing myself in it. I could speak their language when necessary, but I never forgot my own. I could attend their charity galas and private club dinners, but I still preferred corner bodegas to exclusive restaurants. I'd been offered positions at flashier firms, companies that would have meant even more money and prestige, but I stayed at Goldman Sachs because they valued results over pedigree. My success spoke loud enough that eventually, even the most skeptical colleagues had to respect what I'd accomplished. Despite my success, I chose to live modestly. Not out of fear or false humility, but because I'd learned early that happiness doesn't scale with your bank account. I valued the freedom to bike to work when the weather was nice, to leave the office at reasonable hours, to live authentically without the burden of maintaining a lifestyle I didn't need. I rented a small studio in Astoria, Queens, in a neighborhood where families still sat on stoops in the evening and kids played soccer in the streets. My building was next to a Greek bakery where the owner's grandmother still made baklava from scratch every morning, and the smell of honey and phyllo dough would drift through my windows like a lullaby. That's where I met Marcus, actually. It was a rainy Tuesday morning in March, and I was running late for a crucial client meeting. I ducked into the bakery to escape a sudden downpour, ordering a coffee and a pastry while I waited for my Uber. The place was crowded with people seeking shelter from the storm, and I found myself standing next to a tall man with dark hair and kind eyes who was sketching in a notebook while he waited for his order. When we both reached for the last chocolate croissant at the same time, our hands brushed, and he pulled back with an embarrassed laugh. "Great minds think alike," he said, offering me the pastry with a smile that could have powered the entire bakery. "Please take it. I'm Marcus." "Sophia," I replied, accepting the croissant with a grateful smile. "And thank you. I have a feeling I'm going to need all the sugar I can get today." He laughed, a warm sound that made something in my chest flutter. "Rough day ahead?" "Big presentation," I said, checking my phone for the Uber's arrival time. Sometimes I think numbers are easier to predict than people. You work with numbers? Finance, I said simply, which was true enough without being specific. And I work with colors and shapes, he replied, gesturing to his sketchbook. Graphic design. Probably the opposite of predictable. We talked for 20 minutes as the rain drummed against the windows, covering everything from our work to our favorite neighborhoods in the city, to our shared love of old movies and jazz music. He had this way of listening that made you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room, and when he laughed at my terrible jokes about market volatility, I found myself hoping the storm would last a little longer. When my Uber finally arrived, Marcus asked for my number with a nervous confidence that was endearing. Would you maybe want to get coffee sometime? Somewhere with more than one chocolate croissant? I gave him my number, and as I slid into the car, I caught him watching me through the bakery window with a smile that followed me all the way to my meeting. For the first time in years, I wasn't Sophia the finance executive, or Sophia the girl who'd made it out of the Bronx. I was just a woman who'd shared a pastry, and a conversation with a man who made me feel seen without needing to know anything about my portfolio performance or my annual salary. We had our first official date 3 days later at a small Italian restaurant in the village where the tables were so close together you could hear your neighbors' conversations, and the wine came in glasses that didn't match. Marcus showed up with a single sunflower. I know roses are traditional, but sunflowers are hopeful, he explained, and I knew I was in trouble. Over dinner, we talked about everything and nothing. He told me about growing up in Manhattan, but feeling more comfortable in Brooklyn, about his love for design that came from wanting to help small businesses tell their stories, about his dream of opening his own studio someday, where he could work with artists and nonprofits instead of corporate clients. I told him about my neighborhood in Queens, about my parents who'd taught me that dignity didn't depend on your zip code, about my work in finance without mentioning the scale of what I did. When he asked what kind of finance, I said, investments, and left it at that. He didn't press for details, didn't try to impress me with his knowledge of the stock market, or ask pointed questions about my income potential. He seemed genuinely more interested in my thoughts about art, my opinions on the best pizza in the city, and whether I thought the Yankees had a chance this season. Walking me to the subway after dinner, he said, I know this sounds presumptuous, but I really hope this is the beginning of something. I stopped walking and looked at him. This man who'd spent 3 hours talking to me without once asking what I made or where I saw myself in 5 years or whether I had ambition. I hope so too, I said, and meant it completely. We started dating officially 6 weeks later, after a series of dates that felt more like adventures. Museums where we'd make up stories about the people in paintings, food trucks where we'd try cuisines neither of us could pronounce, bookstores where we'd read terrible poetry to each other until we couldn't stop laughing. Marcus was everything genuine in a world that had taught me to be suspicious of sincerity. He remembered details about conversations we'd had weeks earlier. He brought me flowers he'd picked from Central Park, claiming they were more beautiful than anything you could buy. He listened when I talked about my work, without trying to impress me with his own knowledge or connections. Most importantly, he never made me feel like I had to be anything other than exactly who I was. But there was something I noticed early in our relationship, something that cast a shadow over his natural warmth and confidence. He lived under the weight of his family's expectations in a way that seemed to exhaust him. The Williams family wasn't just wealthy. They were old New York money, the kind of family whose name appeared on museum plaques and university buildings. His father, Richard Williams, owned a chain of luxury hotels that catered to international business people and celebrities. His mother, Victoria Williams, was a prominent art dealer whose gallery openings were covered in society magazines. Marcus had grown up in a world where every conversation was a performance, where your worth was measured by your achievements and connections, where love came with conditions and performance metrics. In my family, he told me one evening as we walked through Prospect Park, everything is about maintaining the image. Don't embarrass the family name. Don't associate with the wrong people. Don't make choices that reflect poorly on our reputation. He said it with a laugh, but I could hear the exhaustion underneath. It's like living in a museum where you're both the curator and the exhibit. I began to understand why he'd been drawn to graphic design, to working with small businesses and startups. It was his way of rebelling quietly, of choosing substance over status without completely breaking away from his family's expectations. But I also began to understand why he seemed nervous whenever his parents came up in conversation, why he'd changed the subject when I asked about his childhood, why he'd never suggested I meet them despite the fact that we'd been together for months. "They'll want to know everything about you," he explained one night when I asked why he seemed reluctant to introduce me. "Your background, your education, your family's financial situation, your career prospects. They'll evaluate you like you're a potential business investment." He paused, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I'd learned meant he was struggling with something. "And I don't want you to have to pass their tests to be with me. I don't want their approval to determine our relationship." That's exactly why I protected my secret so carefully. Marcus knew I worked in finance, but when money came up in conversation, I'd simply say I made enough to live comfortably and change the subject. I never lied outright. I just didn't volunteer information that might change how he saw me. Because I needed to know. What did Marcus love about me? Was it Sophia the person? Or would it become Sophia the successful executive if he knew the truth? If he discovered I could afford to help him open that dream studio, would he still see me as the woman who'd shared a chocolate croissant with him in a neighborhood bakery? But deeper than that, I wanted to understand his parents' values. In my professional world, I'd met too many people who sized you up based on your shoes, your handbag, and the restaurant you suggested for lunch. I'd grown tired of those calculating glances, the ones that scanned your appearance and decided your worth before you'd said a word. I didn't resent them. That's just how their world operates. Surfaces before souls, connections before character, portfolio performance before personal integrity. But somewhere in my heart, I still hoped to find people who could see through the expensive veneer, to recognize genuine worth. I remembered my first major client presentation at Goldman Sachs, 3 years into my time there. I'd spent weeks preparing an investment strategy for a tech startup that I believed could revolutionize online education. The client was a billionaire who'd made his fortune in real estate and wanted to diversify into technology. I walked into that conference room wearing my best suit, still the same Macy's outfit I'd worn to job interviews, carrying a presentation that represented weeks of research and analysis. The client took one look at me and asked my supervisor, "Is this the best you could send?" My supervisor, to his credit, said, "She's our most promising analyst. Give her a chance." The client spent the first 10 minutes of my presentation checking his phone, clearly convinced that someone who looked like me couldn't possibly have anything valuable to say. It wasn't until I started breaking down market projections and explaining the psychological factors behind educational technology adoption that he finally looked up. By the end of the meeting, he'd committed to a $50 million investment based on my recommendations. As I packed up my materials, he said, "I have to admit, I misjudged you completely." I smiled politely and said, "That happens more often than you might think." That investment became one of the most successful in the firm's history, and that client became one of my strongest advocates. But I never forgot the lesson of that first impression, how quickly people decide who you are based on what they think they see, and how rarely they bother to look deeper. I started carrying business cards in an expensive leather case, wearing slightly more expensive clothes to important meetings, and learning the subtle signals that communicated success in their world. Not because I'd changed, but because I'd learned that sometimes you have to speak their language before they'll listen to your words. But with Marcus, I didn't want to speak any language except my own. I didn't want him to love me because I was successful, or impressive, or financially secure. I wanted him to love me because of who I was when I thought no one was keeping score. That's why when Victoria Williams called me while I was reviewing investment portfolios on a quiet Thursday afternoon, I felt my heart rate spike with something between anxiety and anticipation. "Sophia, dear," she said in a voice that was perfectly modulated, crystalline in its precision. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all, Mrs. Williams," I replied, minimizing my computer screen automatically. "I've been meaning to reach out for weeks. Marcus has told us so much about you, and Richard and I are simply dying to meet the young woman who's captured our son's heart." Her tone was warm, but there was something underneath it, a quality I couldn't quite identify, but that made me straighten in my chair. "Marcus has mentioned that you work in finance. How lovely. What exactly do you do?" "I work with investments, Mrs. Williams," I said carefully. Oh, investments. How fascinating. Like a financial advisor, helping people plan for retirement? There was something in her voice, not quite condescension, but not quite respect either. A tone that suggested she was already forming conclusions about my education, my income, my suitability for her son. Something like that, I replied. Well, we simply must have you for dinner soon. This Saturday, perhaps? Nothing formal, just family dinner so we can get to know you properly. After I hung up, I sat in my office looking out at the Manhattan skyline, watching helicopters drift between buildings like mechanical birds. I had a decision to make. I could show up as myself, Sophia Martinez, successful venture capital partner, wearing clothes that communicated my actual status and position. We'd have a polite dinner where they'd approve of my achievements and my ability to contribute to their son's lifestyle. Or I could show up as the version of myself they were probably expecting, the struggling finance worker, the girl from a modest background who was clearly punching above her weight by dating their son. That's when the idea crystallized completely. If the Williams family valued status above character, if they judged people based on their assumptions about bank accounts and breeding, I wanted to see their true nature when they believed they were dealing with someone beneath their social circle. So I decided to become an actress in my own social experiment. I would play the role of the girlfriend they could dismiss, the woman they could look down on, the person they'd feel comfortable being their authentic selves around because they'd assume I didn't matter enough to hide their prejudices from. But even as I made that decision, I had no idea how completely the evening would change everything I thought I knew about love, respect, and the price of pretending to be someone you're not. The Saturday morning of the dinner dawned gray and overcast, with that particular October chill that cuts through even the warmest coat. I stood in my small apartment looking out at the Manhattan Bridge, watching traffic flow between boroughs like blood through arteries, and felt something between excitement and dread settling in my stomach. My closet held two different versions of my life. On one side hung the clothes I wore to work, tailored blazers that cost more than some people's rent, silk blouses that whispered success, shoes that communicated competence and authority. These were the clothes of Sophia Martinez, venture capital partner, woman who could approve millions in funding with a phone call. On the other side, pushed toward the back, were the clothes I'd kept from my earlier days. Simpler pieces, some from college, others from my first years working in finance, when every purchase was carefully calculated against my budget. I reached past the expensive blazers and pulled out a navy blue dress I'd bought at Target 3 years ago, when I was between dry cleaning appointments and needed something professional but affordable. It was cotton, machine washable, with a modest neckline and 3/4 sleeves. The hem had a small snag from catching it on a subway turnstile, and the color had faded slightly from multiple washings. I held it up against myself in the mirror. It was perfectly respectable, but unmistakably inexpensive. This was exactly what I wanted. Next, I chose my shoes carefully. In the back of my closet were the black flats I'd worn during my first year at Goldman Sachs, before my salary allowed for the Italian leather heels I preferred now. They were scuffed at the toes, the leather creased from walking miles of Manhattan sidewalks, but they were clean and well-maintained. I knew Victoria Williams would notice my shoes before she made eye contact. That's how women like her operated, scanning from feet to hair in one practiced assessment that determined your worth before you spoke. For jewelry, I chose only the small silver cross my grandmother had given me for my high school graduation, hanging from a simple chain that had cost less than $20. No watch, no earrings, no rings except for the simple band I wore on my right hand that had belonged to my mother. My makeup routine was deliberately minimal, just enough to look put together, not enough to suggest vanity or expense. I braided my hair simply, the way I'd worn it in college when I couldn't afford regular salon visits. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. Gone was Sophia Martinez, the polished professional who could hold her own in any boardroom. In her place stood someone softer, younger, more uncertain, someone who looked like she might be grateful for any kindness from people like the Williams family. Before leaving my apartment, I stopped at a small bodega near my building, the same one where I'd bought groceries during my student days when every dollar mattered. I chose a simple box of cookies from the shelf. Nothing fancy. Nothing that would suggest I'd put significant thought or money into the gesture. "Could you wrap this in brown paper?" I asked the elderly man behind the counter, someone who'd seen me grow from a struggling student to a successful professional over the years. He raised an eyebrow but complied. "You okay, Sophia? You look different today." I smiled. "Just visiting some people who probably won't be impressed by fancy packaging." He tied the package with simple kitchen twine, and I slipped it into a canvas tote bag that had seen better days. Everything about my appearance was carefully calculated to communicate financial constraint without looking sloppy or disrespectful. The subway ride to the Upper East Side felt longer than usual, giving me time to think about what I was doing and why. Part of me was excited by the performance aspect, the challenge of inhabiting a different version of myself, of seeing how convincingly I could portray someone whose financial circumstances were dramatically different from my reality. But underneath that excitement was something more serious, a genuine desire to understand how people behave when they think they're dealing with someone who has nothing to offer them, someone they can dismiss without consequences. In my professional life, I'd seen both sides of this equation. I'd watched colleagues treat service staff with casual dismissal, assuming their jobs made them invisible. I'd also seen how those same colleagues transformed when they discovered someone's unexpected connections or credentials. I wanted to know which version of human nature I'd encounter at the Williams family dinner table. The Upper East Side had always felt like a different city to me, even after years of visiting for business meetings and client dinners. The buildings were taller, the sidewalks cleaner, the very air somehow more expensive. Trees lined streets where every car was either a luxury sedan or an SUV that cost more than most people's annual salaries. When my taxi stopped in front of the Williams residence, I took a deep breath and stepped onto the sidewalk. The house rose before me like something from a period film. 4 stories of pale limestone with black wrought iron balconies, tall windows that glowed warmly against the gray afternoon, and a garden that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never worried about a water bill. Everything about the building communicated old money and established power. Not the flashy wealth of new fortunes, but the quiet, confident luxury of families who'd been rich so long they'd forgotten there was any other way to live. I walked up the front steps, my modest flats silent on stone that had probably cost more per square foot than most apartments. The heavy wooden door was painted glossy black, with brass hardware that gleamed like it was polished daily. Before I could ring the bell, the door opened to reveal Victoria Williams in all her carefully maintained glory. She appeared to be in her early 50s, though with the kind of polished beauty that made precise age impossible to determine. Her blonde hair was swept into a perfect chignon that hadn't moved despite the October breeze, and she wore what I immediately recognized as a Chanel suit in cream wool that probably cost more than 3 months of most people's salaries. Pearl earrings caught the light as she smiled, and her makeup was so expertly applied it looked effortless while being anything but. Everything about her appearance had been calculated to communicate elegance, sophistication, and the kind of wealth that never had to announce itself because it was simply assumed. "Sophia," she exclaimed, her voice warm and welcoming in a way that immediately made me suspicious. "How wonderful to finally meet you. Marcus has told us so much about you." Her eyes performed their assessment in one swift, practiced motion, starting with my face, dropping to take in my simple dress, pausing on my worn shoes, and finally settling on the canvas bag in my hands with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Please come in," she continued, stepping aside to reveal the marble foyer behind her. "Richard is so looking forward to meeting you." The entrance hall was like stepping into a museum. Gleaming white marble floors, a chandelier that threw rainbow patterns across the walls, and fresh flowers arranged in a crystal vase that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Original artwork lined the walls, pieces I recognized from auction catalogs I'd reviewed for clients. "What a lovely home," I said, which was true, even if it felt more like a showroom than a place where people actually lived and laughed and made memories. "Thank you, dear." Richard designed most of the interior himself. He has such an extraordinary eye for beauty. Richard Williams appeared from what looked like a library, tall and distinguished in his navy blazer and perfectly pressed slacks. His silver hair was styled in a way that probably required more maintenance than my entire beauty routine. And when he shook my hand, his grip was firm enough to assert dominance but cool enough to maintain appropriate distance. "Sophia, welcome," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from a lifetime of being the most important person in most rooms. "Marcus tells me you work in finance." "Yes, sir," I replied, playing my role perfectly. I work at an investment firm downtown. Ah, he said, drawing out the word as if tasting it. One of the boutique firms, I imagine. So many young people are drawn to finance these days. His tone carried the faintest trace of condescension, as though my choice of career was charmingly naive rather than professionally serious. When I simply nodded and said nothing more, I could see him filing away information, drawing conclusions about my education, my background, my prospects. Marcus joined us in the foyer, and I felt my heart clench with affection for this man I'd grown to love. He looked handsome in his dark slacks and white button-down shirt, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he was monitoring his parents' expressions. "Mom, Dad, this is Sophia," he said, placing a gentle hand on my back. The gesture was protective, supportive, but I could feel his anxiety radiating through his fingers. "We're so delighted to meet you properly," Victoria said, leading us toward what appeared to be a living room. Marcus has been quite secretive about his personal life lately. The living room was a masterpiece of interior design. Persian rugs that belonged in museums, furniture that looked like it had been selected for a magazine shoot, and artwork that represented more money than most people would see in a lifetime. Every surface was polished to a mirror shine, every pillow positioned with mathematical precision. "Can I offer you something to drink?" Victoria asked, settling gracefully onto a cream-colored sofa that probably cost more than my car. "Wine? Champagne? We have a lovely Bordeaux that Richard brought back from our last trip to France." "Water would be perfect," I said, settling onto the edge of a chair that felt too expensive to fully relax into. I caught the quick glance Victoria and Richard exchanged, the kind of wordless communication that long-married couples perfect over decades. They were filing away information. The girlfriend who chose water over wine, who perched nervously on expensive furniture, who carried her offering in a canvas bag rather than arriving with professional flowers or expensive chocolates. "So tell us about yourself, Sophia," Richard said, settling into what was clearly his usual chair. "Where did you grow up?" "The Bronx," I replied simply. "The Bronx," Victoria repeated, her tone suggesting she was trying to place it geographically. "How authentic. And your family? What do they do?" This was where the real test began. I could feel Marcus tensing beside me, knowing that my answers would determine how the rest of the evening proceeded. "My father is a mechanic," I said. "My mother cleaned office buildings for most of my childhood." The silence that followed was brief, but telling. Victoria's smile remained perfectly in place, but I caught the almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes. Richard nodded as if this information fit perfectly into some internal calculation he was performing. "How wonderful," Victoria said, her voice carrying that particular tone wealthy people use when they want to sound supportive of the working class while maintaining their distance from it. "Hard-working people. That must have taught you such valuable lessons about perseverance." The way she said perseverance made it sound like a quaint character trait rather than a necessity for survival. "And where did you go to school?" Richard continued, his tone suggesting this was a formality rather than genuine curiosity. "Columbia," I said. This seemed to surprise them both, though they recovered quickly. Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly before settling back into their carefully maintained arch. "Columbia? How impressive. On scholarship, I imagine." "Yes. Wonderful," she said, though her tone suggested she found it more convenient than wonderful. "It's so important that universities make opportunities available to diverse students." The conversation continued over pre-dinner drinks, with Victoria sharing stories about their recent trip to the Venice Biennale and Richard discussing his expansion into international luxury hotels. They weren't trying to be deliberately exclusive. They simply lived in a world where dropping $30,000 on a weekend trip was casual conversation rather than a display of wealth. "We just acquired the most beautiful pieces," Victoria was saying, her hands moving gracefully as she described paintings I'd probably seen in auction catalogs worth millions. "The art market in Venice is simply extraordinary right now." I nodded politely, playing the role of someone who was impressed by their sophistication rather than someone who could have funded their entire art collection with a phone call. "Do you have any interest in art, Sophia?" Victoria asked, her tone suggesting she was being generous by including me in the conversation. "I enjoy museums when I have time," I replied, which was true enough. "Of course," she said with a knowing smile. "I imagine you're quite busy with work. Entry-level positions in finance can be so demanding." The assumption stung, even though I'd orchestrated it completely. Richard leaned forward slightly, his expression taking on what I assumed he thought was a mentoring tone. "What exactly do you do at this investment firm? Customer service? Administrative support?" I felt Marcus shift uncomfortably beside me. "I work with client portfolios," I said simply, which was technically accurate even if it dramatically understated the scope of my responsibilities. Richard nodded as if everything was becoming clear. "Account management. That's how many people start in finance." Very sensible. The condescension was so casual, so automatic, that I wondered if he even realized he was doing it. To him, I was simply a young woman from a working-class background who'd managed to get an entry-level job in finance, someone to be politely encouraged but not taken seriously. Victoria stood gracefully, smoothing her skirt. "Shall we move to the dining room? I believe dinner is ready." The dining room was even more impressive than the living room, if that was possible. A mahogany table that could seat 12 dominated the space, set with china that looked like it belonged in a museum, and crystal that caught the light from yet another chandelier. Fresh flowers, white orchids, I noticed, were arranged in low centerpieces that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. I was seated beside Marcus, facing Victoria, with Richard at the head of the table, in a chair that looked more like a throne than dining furniture. The positioning felt deliberate, me as the guest under examination, them as the tribunal determining my worthiness. A uniformed server appeared as if by magic, setting down the first course, what Victoria announced as butternut squash soup with truffle oil and microgreens from our private garden upstate. The server disappeared just as silently, leaving us in the kind of quiet luxury that money can buy but character creates. "This is delicious," I said, which was true. The soup was perfectly prepared, with flavors that spoke of professional kitchen staff and ingredients that were chosen for quality rather than cost. "Thank you, dear," Victoria replied. "Our chef trained in France. We're so fortunate to have found someone who understands our particular standards." The conversation resumed its careful dance around class differences and social expectations. Victoria discussed their upcoming charity gala. Just a small affair, maybe 200 people, to raise money for arts education. While Richard mentioned business colleagues whose names I recognized from Forbes lists and society pages, they weren't trying to be deliberately intimidating. This was simply their world, one where casual conversations involved six-figure donations and international travel was as routine as taking the subway was for most people. "We just committed to funding a new wing at the Metropolitan Museum," Victoria was saying, dabbing her lips delicately with a napkin that probably cost more than most people's dinnerware. "It's so important to give back to the cultural institutions that make New York special." I nodded appreciatively, playing my role as someone who was impressed by their philanthropy, rather than someone who'd made larger donations to arts organizations without feeling the need to announce them over dinner. "Do you do much charitable work, Sophia?" Richard asked, his tone suggesting this was more politeness than genuine interest. "I volunteer when I can," I replied, thinking of the financial literacy workshops I taught at community centers in Queens and the Bronx. Work I did under my own name with my own expertise, helping families understand investments and savings in ways their banks had never bothered to explain. "How wonderful," Victoria said, her smile suggesting she found my volunteerism charming in the way that small gestures from people with limited resources often are to those with unlimited ones. The main course arrived, herb-crusted salmon with what the server announced as seasonal vegetables from our private garden, and the conversation took a slightly more pointed turn. "Tell me, Sophia," Richard said, cutting his salmon with surgical precision. "What are your long-term goals? Do you see yourself staying in finance?" It was a loaded question, designed to assess my ambition, my realistic prospects, and probably my suitability as a long-term partner for their son. "I'd like to continue growing in the field," I said carefully. "Finance offers a lot of opportunities for people who work hard." "Indeed it does," he agreed, though his tone suggested he was thinking of opportunities somewhat different from the ones I'd already achieved. "Competition can be quite fierce, though, especially for people without extensive networks." The implication was clear. Success in finance required connections I probably didn't have, advantages that came from background rather than ability. Marcus finally spoke up. Sophia's very talented at what she does. Her colleagues respect her work. It was a gentle defense, but I could hear the limitation in it. He was defending my competence rather than my achievements, my potential rather than my actual success. "I'm sure she is," Victoria said with a maternal smile that felt anything but nurturing. "Talent and hard work can take you quite far, even without the traditional advantages." The way she said traditional advantages made it sound like she was talking about genetic traits rather than inherited wealth and social connections. As dinner progressed, their questions became more pointed, their assessments more obvious. Where did I live? The Upper East Side can be quite expensive for someone just starting out. What did my parents think of my career choice? I'm sure they're proud that you've moved beyond their circumstances. Did I have any investments? It's never too early to start thinking about your financial future. Each question was designed to confirm what they'd already decided about me, that I was a nice enough girl from a modest background who was probably out of her depth in their world, someone who might be a temporary diversion for their son, but certainly not a permanent fixture. Through it all, Marcus remained largely silent, occasionally trying to change the subject, but never directly challenging his parents' assumptions, or defending me from their subtle condescension. I could see the conflict in his eyes, torn between protecting me and avoiding confrontation with parents who'd controlled his life through guilt and expectation since childhood. He'd grown up in this house, shaped by their values and their definitions of success. Maybe he'd never seen anyone walk into their world without trying to prove they belonged there. When dessert arrived, an elaborate chocolate soufflé that had probably taken hours to prepare, Victoria decided to be more direct. "Sophia, dear," she began, her tone taking on the careful modulation of someone about to deliver news they considered important. "I hope you won't mind me being frank with you." I set down my spoon carefully, meeting her gaze directly. "Of course not. Marcus is going to inherit considerable responsibility someday," she continued, her hands folded gracefully on the table. "The hotels, the properties, the social obligations that come with our family name. It's a world that requires particular skills and understanding." Richard nodded in agreement, his expression taking on the serious look of someone discussing business strategy. "It's not about money, you understand. It's about fitting in with our peers, understanding the social nuances that frankly take generations to learn." I could feel the trap closing around me, not the one I'd set by pretending to be someone I wasn't, but the one they'd constructed based on their assumptions about who I was and what I could offer their son. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked, keeping my voice level. Victoria exchanged a quick glance with her husband before continuing. "Well, we've been thinking about your future, yours and Marcus's, and we wonder whether you've really considered what a long-term relationship would require." She paused delicately, as if the next words were difficult for her to say. "Love is wonderful, but it isn't always enough, is it? Relationships require compatibility on so many levels: social, intellectual, financial." The word financial hung in the air like a challenge. "I mean," she continued, her voice taking on a tone that suggested she was being reasonable rather than insulting, "you seem like a lovely girl, truly. But Marcus has been raised in a certain world, with certain expectations. The charity events, the business dinners, the need to represent our family appropriately in society." Richard leaned forward slightly. "We're not trying to be cruel, Sophia. We're simply being realistic about what the future holds. Someone in your position might find it difficult to navigate the demands of our social circle." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not hurt, exactly, but a crystalline clarity about exactly what was happening. They weren't just questioning my suitability for their son. They were doing it with such casual certainty that they didn't even realize how insulting they were being. Marcus finally found his voice. "Mom, Dad, that's not—" "Let me finish, sweetheart," Victoria interrupted smoothly, not taking her eyes off me. "Sophia, if you truly care about Marcus, and I believe you do, then you must see that holding him back from his potential isn't fair to either of you." She reached into her purse, a leather bag that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and pulled out an envelope. With deliberate grace, she slid it across the mahogany table toward me. "We've taken the liberty of writing you a check," she said, her voice carrying the tone of someone offering a generous gift rather than delivering an insult. $100,000. Enough to help you get established somewhere else, perhaps pursue some education that would improve your prospects. The room fell completely silent, except for the soft ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the corner. The envelope sat on the table between us like a landmine, waiting for someone to make the wrong move. Marcus stared at the envelope in shock, his face cycling through disbelief, horror, and something that looked like shame. Richard watched with the calm satisfaction of someone who'd just solved a complex business problem. Victoria maintained her perfectly composed smile, clearly pleased with what she considered her elegant handling of a delicate situation. I picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of it in my hands. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind of stationery that communicated old money and unquestioned authority. $100,000, I repeated slowly. "Consider it an investment in everyone's happiness," Victoria said, her tone suggesting she was being generous rather than cruel. "You get a fresh start, perhaps somewhere more suitable to your background. And Marcus gets the opportunity to find someone who can truly complement his position in life." I opened the envelope and looked at the check. Victoria Williams' signature was elegant and confident, flowing across the bottom of a piece of paper worth more than many people's annual salaries. "This is very generous," I said quietly, my voice giving no hint of what I was thinking. Victoria smiled triumphantly. "We knew you'd understand. You seem like a practical girl." I folded the check carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Around the table, everyone seemed to be holding their breath. The crystal glasses still sparkled in the chandelier light. The chocolate soufflé sat forgotten on bone china plates. The classical music continued its soft background melody from speakers hidden somewhere in the walls. But something in the room had shifted completely. "Mrs. Williams," I said, my voice calm and clear, "I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about who I am." Her smile faltered slightly. "I'm sorry?" I reached into my simple canvas bag, the one that had telegraphed my modest circumstances so effectively all evening, and pulled out a leather card case. It was plain, unremarkable, the kind of business card holder you might pick up at any office supply store. I selected one card and placed it carefully on the table next to their check. "My name is Sophia Martinez," I said, my voice steady and measured. "I'm a senior partner in the venture capital division of Goldman Sachs. I manage investment portfolios worth over $500 million, and I make approximately what your hotel chain grosses in a good quarter." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's face went pale, her carefully maintained composure cracking like expensive makeup in hot weather. Richard's fork clattered against his plate, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. Marcus stared at my business card, as if it might transform into something else if he looked away. I continued speaking, my voice never rising above conversational level, but carrying through the room like a bell. "I chose to dress modestly tonight, and to let you draw your own conclusions about my background, because I wanted to understand what kind of people you really are when you think you're dealing with someone you can dismiss without consequence." Victoria's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. When she finally managed to speak, her voice came out as barely a whisper. You're not what you appeared to be." "No," I agreed. "I'm not. Just like your kindness wasn't what it appeared to be either." I picked up their check and held it between my fingers, the paper crisp and official, and completely meaningless to someone with my actual financial situation. $100,000, I said, looking directly at Victoria. "Do you know what I paid in taxes last month? More than twice this amount." I tore the check in half, then quarters, letting the pieces fall onto the pristine white tablecloth like confetti at a very expensive party. "But here's what's interesting," I continued, my tone remaining conversational despite the bomb I'd just detonated. "You assumed that, because I didn't wear designer clothes or arrive in a luxury car, I must be someone who could be bought off with the right price. You thought my feelings for your son were so shallow that money could make me disappear." Richard cleared his throat uncomfortably, trying to regain some semblance of control over the situation. "Sophia, we may have misjudged." "You didn't misjudge me," I interrupted gently but firmly. "You revealed yourselves. The way you've treated me tonight, the assumptions you've made, The casual cruelty wrapped in politeness. That's who you are when you think you're dealing with someone beneath you. I turned to Marcus, who had remained frozen throughout my revelation. You knew, didn't you? Maybe not the exact details, but you suspected I was more than I appeared to be. He nodded slowly, unable to meet my eyes. I wondered, but I was afraid to ask, afraid of what it might change between us. What it changed, I said softly, is that it showed me you were ashamed of what you thought I was, instead of being proud of who you knew me to be. I stood up, smoothing my simple navy dress, the one that had convinced them I was beneath their notice. Thank you for dinner, and for the education. Victoria finally recovered enough to speak, though her voice shook slightly. Sophia, please, you have to understand. We were only trying to protect Marcus. Protect him from what? I asked. From someone who loved him enough to let your family judge her without defending herself? From someone who was willing to be insulted for an entire evening just to see if you had enough character to treat a supposed stranger with basic respect? I walked toward the door, pausing only to add, "Oh, and Mrs. Williams, that art collection you mentioned from Venice? My firm helped finance the acquisition of several pieces from that same auction house last year. The dealer is actually a friend of mine." I could hear Victoria's sharp intake of breath behind me, but I didn't turn around. If you'll excuse me, I have an early flight tomorrow. I'm meeting with investors in London who understand that respect isn't contingent on appearances or bank account balances. Marcus stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. Sophia, please don't leave like this. We need to talk. I turned to look at him one final time. This man I'd cared about deeply, who'd made me laugh and feel seen and understood. When you decide whether you want the real me or the version of me that fits their expectations, give me a call. I walked down the long hallway lined with family photos. Marcus as a boy at expensive schools, Victoria at charity events, Richard receiving business awards, each image perfectly framed and carefully curated to project success and status. When I opened the heavy front door, the cool October air hit my face like freedom itself. The city stretched out beyond their manicured garden, real, alive, honest in its chaos and diversity. I walked slowly down Fifth Avenue, past the bright windows of shops I could easily afford but had never needed to visit to feel valuable. The sidewalks were full of people heading home from dinner, from dates, from whatever small adventures made up their Saturday nights. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Please wait. I can explain. This isn't how I wanted things to go. I looked at the message for a long moment, then typed back. The only thing to explain is why you sat there and let them treat someone you supposedly love like she was beneath your family's notice. When you figure that out, we can talk. That night, I sat in my small apartment in Queens, still wearing the simple navy dress, drinking tea from a mug my mother had given me years ago. Through my window, I could see the lights of Manhattan glittering across the water, the same view that had inspired me through years of struggle and success. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires energy, and I felt drained rather than energized by the evening's events. Mostly, I felt sad. Sad that people so intelligent could be so blind to their own cruelty. Sad that Marcus had been shaped by their values for so long that he couldn't see past them when it mattered. Sad that wealth and education hadn't taught the Williams family the most basic lesson about human dignity. But underneath the sadness was something else. Relief. Relief that I'd seen the truth before, investing more of my heart in someone who wasn't ready to stand up for what was right when it cost him something. Relief that I'd discovered the Williams family's true character before I'd had to navigate years of subtle condescension and casual dismissal. And strangely, relief that I'd been brave enough to play a role that revealed not just their prejudices, but my own strength. Over the next week, my phone rang constantly. Marcus called repeatedly, leaving voicemails that cycled through apologies, explanations, and pleas for a chance to make things right. Victoria left 2 messages, her voice carefully modulated as she attempted to explain that they'd simply been concerned about my compatibility with their family's lifestyle. Richard sent a formal letter on his law firm's letterhead, suggesting that perhaps we could start fresh with a better understanding of everyone's circumstances. I didn't respond to any of them. 2 weeks after the dinner, Marcus appeared at my office building, waiting by the security desk with the same determination he'd once shown when pursuing a particularly challenging design project. "They want to make things right," he said when I agreed to see him in the lobby. "Mom is mortified. Dad says he's never misjudged anyone so completely. They want to apologize properly, to get to know the real you." I studied his face. The man I'd shared chocolate croissants with, who'd brought me flowers from Central Park, who'd made me laugh until my sides hurt. "What do you want, Marcus?" "I want us," he said simply. "I want to try again, but with complete honesty this time. No pretenses, no games, just truth." I considered his words carefully, remembering the boy in those family photos who'd been taught that image mattered more than integrity. The problem isn't that your parents misjudged my financial situation. The problem is how they treated someone they thought was beneath them. And the bigger problem is that you sat there and let them do it. He dropped his gaze, his voice barely audible. "I know. I was a coward. You were trained to value the wrong things," I said more gently. "That's not entirely your fault. But choosing to continue valuing those things as an adult, especially when someone you supposedly love is being disrespected, that's a choice you made." He looked up then, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I can change. I want to change. What happened that night, it opened my eyes to things I'd been blind to my whole life. I felt a moment of softness for him, for the man he wanted to become rather than the one he'd been raised to be. Maybe you can change. But I can't be the teacher in that process. I can't be the one who helps you discover your own character. That's work you have to do yourself." 3 months later, I heard through mutual friends that Marcus had quietly distanced himself from his family's business, taking a position with a nonprofit that provided design services to community organizations in underserved neighborhoods. He'd moved to Brooklyn, was volunteering with youth programs in areas not unlike where I'd grown up. I felt a moment of pride for the courage it must have taken to walk away from the security his family represented, even if it had come too late for us. 6 months after that, I received a handwritten letter. Marcus's familiar script filled 2 pages, telling me about the work he was doing, the people he was meeting, the way his perspective on success and worth had fundamentally shifted. "I understand now what you were trying to show me," he wrote. "I hope you're well. And I hope you know that knowing you changed my life for the better, even if I wasn't brave enough to deserve you when it mattered." I smiled as I read his words, feeling nothing but warmth for the person he was becoming. Growth is possible for everyone, but it has to be chosen, earned, lived into with intention and courage. My experience with the Williams family inspired me to start something I called the Real Worth Initiative, a mentorship and scholarship program for young women from working-class backgrounds entering competitive fields like finance, law, and consulting. We met monthly, not in the boardrooms and exclusive clubs where traditional networking happened, but in community centers and coffee shops in Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. Places where authenticity mattered more than appearance, where success was measured in community impact rather than individual accumulation. At our first gathering, I told my story, the whole truth about that dinner, about pretending to be poor, about the check torn into pieces, about learning that respect given conditionally isn't respect at all. I learned something that night, I told the group of 15 young women whose faces reflected my own journey from doubt to determination. Your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it. It exists independent of their approval, their acceptance, or their understanding. A young woman named Elena, a first-generation college student studying economics, raised her hand. But what if we need their approval to succeed? What if playing their game is the only way to get ahead in fields they control? I smiled, remembering my own younger self asking similar questions. There's a difference between adapting to professional requirements and betraying who you are at your core. You can learn their language without forgetting your own. You can respect their protocols without accepting their prejudices. But how do you know when you're compromising too much? Asked another participant, Maria, whose parents had immigrated from El Salvador and who was working her way through law school. "You'll know," I said, thinking of that moment when Victoria had slid the check across the table, when silence would have meant accepting their assessment of my worth. "You'll feel it in your chest when someone crosses the line from professional expectation to personal disrespect. And that's when you decide who you want to be." The program grew beyond anything I'd imagined. Within a year, we had chapters in Boston, Chicago, and Los Angeles. with a waiting list of mentors from diverse backgrounds who wanted to help. The women who participated didn't just advance in their careers. They advanced with their integrity intact, their sense of self strengthened rather than diminished by their success. We created scholarship funds, internship programs, and networking events that focused on substance rather than surface. Most importantly, we created a community where young women could discuss the real challenges of navigating professional worlds that weren't designed for people like them. 2 years after starting the program, I was promoted to managing director of my division, making me the youngest woman to reach that level in Goldman Sachs' history. When Forbes interviewed me about breaking barriers in finance, the reporter asked what advice I'd give to other young women from underrepresented backgrounds entering competitive fields. "Never let anyone convince you that you need to be smaller to fit into their space," I said. "If their space doesn't have room for who you are, build your own space instead. And remember that respect isn't something you earn by proving you belong. It's something you demand by refusing to accept anything less." The article ran with a photo of me in my office, wearing a simple black dress and my grandmother's silver cross, the same one I'd worn to that dinner with the Williams family. When I saw the image, I thought about the journey that had brought me from that night of pretense to this moment of authentic success. 3 years later, I had another unexpected encounter that brought everything full circle. I was having lunch at a small cafe in Soho when I noticed Victoria Williams at a corner table, looking significantly older than I remembered. She was alone, picking at a salad and reading what appeared to be a nonprofit annual report. Our eyes met across the restaurant, and after a moment of hesitation, she approached my table. "Sophia," she said, her voice lacking the confident authority I remembered. "I hope I'm not intruding." I gestured to the empty chair across from me. "Please sit." She looked different. Not just older, but somehow smaller, less certain of her place in the world. Her clothes were still expensive, but she wore them like armor rather than decoration. "I've been following your work," she said without preamble. "The mentorship program, your promotion, the article in Forbes. I wanted to tell you. I've been thinking about that dinner for 3 years. I waited, curious to hear what 3 years of reflection had taught her. "I was wrong," she continued, her voice quiet but steady. "Not just about your financial situation, but about everything. The way I treated you, the assumptions I made, the things I valued. You were right to walk away." She paused, seeming to gather her courage. "Marcus told me what you said about respect being conditional. I've been involved with a literacy program in East Harlem for the past 2 years, working directly with families rather than just writing checks. And I finally understand what you meant." I studied her face, seeing something I'd never witnessed that night at dinner. Genuine humility. "People have been treating me the way I treated you," she continued. "Politely, professionally, but without real respect. Because they see my background and assume I'm just another wealthy woman playing at charity work, rather than someone who genuinely wants to learn and help." She smiled ruefully. "It's a humbling experience being underestimated, being judged before you speak." "What changed your mind?" I asked. "Working with a family whose teenage daughter reminded me of you," she said. "Brilliant, determined, from a background where every achievement required twice the effort. Watching how she navigated a world that didn't see her potential, I finally understood what strength really looks like." We talked for over an hour, and I found myself seeing glimpses of the woman Victoria might have been without the insulation of inherited wealth and social position. She asked thoughtful questions about my program, shared stories about the families she was working with, and acknowledged mistakes with a directness that surprised me. When we parted, she said, "I don't expect forgiveness, and I know we'll never be friends. But I wanted you to know that you changed something important in our family. Marcus is doing work he's proud of now, and I'm learning that real worth has nothing to do with bank balances or social connections." I watched her walk away, thinking about the courage it had taken to approach me, to admit she'd been wrong, to change her life in ways that probably cost her some of her old social circle. People can change, I realized, but only if they're willing to do the hard work of examining their assumptions and challenging their inherited beliefs about worth and value. That same week, I had dinner with my parents in the Bronx, in the same small apartment where I'd learned that dignity comes from within. My mother, now retired from her night shift cleaning jobs, listened to my stories about London investors and $100 million deals with the same attention she'd once given to my elementary school math homework. "Mija," she said as we shared the flan she'd made from her grandmother's recipe, "you remember what I always told you?" I nodded, smiling at the familiar refrain. Money doesn't make you better than anyone. How you treat people when you have nothing to gain from them. That's your true character. And what did you learn from those rich people? I thought about Victoria's check, Richard's condescension, Marcus's silence, and then Victoria's quiet transformation 3 years later. "I learned that having everything can make you poor in the ways that matter most," I said. "But I also learned that people can change if they're brave enough to see past their own privilege." My mother nodded approvingly. "And you learned you don't need anyone's permission to know your own worth." Outside the window, the familiar sounds of the Bronx continued. Children playing, neighbors talking, life moving forward with honesty and hope. The same sounds that had shaped me into someone who valued substance over surface, character over credentials, integrity over image. Today, I still live modestly, though I've moved from Queens to a one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn with a view of the Manhattan Bridge. I still take the subway to work most days, still stop at corner delis for coffee, still believe that the best conversations happen in places without dress codes or pretensions. The difference is that I no longer question my worth based on others' ability to recognize it. I know who I am, what I've earned, and what I deserve, not because of my title or my salary, but because of how I choose to move through the world. My Real Worth initiative now operates in 8 cities, has provided scholarships to over 200 young women, and has created a network of professionals who understand that success means lifting others as you climb, rather than pulling the ladder up behind you. Sometimes people ask me if I regret that dinner, if I wish I'd handled it differently, if the deception was worth the pain it caused. I always say no. That evening taught me something invaluable. Authenticity isn't about revealing everything to everyone. It's about never betraying yourself to gain acceptance from people who don't deserve your truth. The Williams family's casual cruelty that night revealed their character in ways that years of polite interaction never could have. Their assumption that money could solve what they saw as the problem of my background showed me exactly what they valued and what they didn't. But more importantly, it showed me my own strength, my ability to sit through their condescension without internalizing their judgments, my capacity to reveal my true position without using it as a weapon, my willingness to walk away from someone I loved because I loved myself more. That night, I learned that some people measure worth in dollars and status symbols. But the ones worth knowing measure it in integrity, kindness, and the courage to stand up for what's right, especially when it costs you something to do so. In the years since, I've encountered many more people like the Williams family, those who assume your value based on your appearance, who offer conditional respect based on perceived status, who mistake their privilege for wisdom. But I've also met countless others who understand that true worth isn't up for debate, negotiation, or approval by committee. It simply is. And sometimes, all it takes is one dinner, one moment of testing and revelation, to discover exactly who you are and what you're willing to accept from the world. Your worth isn't measured by designer clothes or expensive cars or exclusive addresses. It's not determined by who accepts you or who doesn't, who approves of your choices or who questions your value. Your worth is inherent, unshakable, and completely independent of other people's ability to recognize it. The most expensive lesson I ever received came free, served on bone china in a mansion on the Upper East Side, where I learned that the highest forms of wealth have nothing to do with money, and everything to do with knowing exactly who you are when the world tries to tell you who you should be. Remember that. Hold on to it. And never let anyone convince you to be smaller to fit into their idea of who deserves respect. Because sometimes, the greatest gift you can give yourself is the clarity that comes from seeing exactly what you're dealing with before you invest too much of your heart in the wrong people. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is walk away from a table where respect isn't being served. No matter how expensive the china, no matter how exclusive the guest list, no matter how much it costs you to leave, your dignity is worth more than their approval. Your authenticity is worth more than their acceptance. Your truth is worth more than their comfort. And you, exactly as you are, wherever you come from, whatever you've achieved or haven't yet, you are worth more than their limited ability to see it. That's not just my story. That's a reminder for anyone who's ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told they don't belong. You belong wherever your character, your effort, and your integrity take you. And anyone who can't see that simply isn't looking hard enough. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment about a time when you had to choose between acceptance and authenticity. Subscribe so we can continue these conversations about worth, dignity, and the courage to be exactly who you are in a world that profits from your insecurity. Because your story matters. Your worth matters. And you matter, not because of what you have or what you've achieved, but because of who you choose to be when nobody's keeping score.